6 years after the overthrow of Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, the country is still on the edge of chaos. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. The latest round of United Nations talks aimed at bridging differences between rival Libyan factions ended last month in a stalemate. No progress towards stabilising the country and paving the way for more elections. Political and military fractures have left Libya mired in conflict, its economy essentially in free fall since Muammar Gaddafi was ousted in 2011 after 42 years in power. The country, of about 6.3 million people, is divided regionally, with multiple groups vying for control. And Libya has also become a magnet for migrants desperate to start new lives in Europe. If that weren't enough, with Islamic State on the run in Iraq and Syria, there's renewed concern that it could take advantage of Libya's chaos and regroup there as well. Well, there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from London is Guma El-Gamaty, a member of the UN-backed Libyan political dialogue process. He was signatory to the 2015 political agreement designed to stabilise the country. Also, Elissa Miller is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Hariri Centre for the Middle East. She joins us from Boston. And with us from Rome is Jean-Louis Romanet Perroux. He focuses on security, society and governance as a research leader for the EU's delegation to Libya. And also with us from London is commentator and documentary producer Sukant Chandan. He has a recent film entitled NATO's War on Libya. Thanks so much for joining us, all of you. Guma, let's start with you in London. 2011, a big tumultuous year, but as we said, that was 6 years ago. Why hasn't Libya been able to be put back together again and on the path to recovery and development?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the program. I think to explore why the transition after the Gaddafi the Gaddafi regime fall in 2011, why the transition did not go smoothly is really a big question. I think it will take a lot of time to answer that question properly. But let me just give very few pointers. I think number one is the legacy of the 42 years of the Gaddafi regime itself. Gaddafi over 42 years decimated any forms of state institution whatsoever. So we left with literally vacuum. The whole country for 42 years was revolving around one personality and his cult. No institutions. So we left with a vacuum. No proper coherent army, no proper police force, no security institutions. So that vacuum meant that it was filled by militias, which they proliferated in big numbers. The second key point, I think, is that also, the legacy of Gaddafi meant no political culture whatsoever of culture of consensus building, of accord building, of pluralism, of political parties and civil society. None of that we had in the 42 years of the Gaddafi. We had no constitution since 1969, which now makes it 48 years the country has not even known a constitution. A third thing I think now is, which cannot be ignored in the last 3 years, is the detrimental negative regional interference from regional players who are supporting one side or the other. They are fueling the conflict. They are pouring oil over fire, and that is prolonging the conflict and the suffering, and it's not allowing or helping Libya to be stabilized.
Jim, thanks for setting that up, although there is big disagreement is certainly on two of the elements of what you just said. Sukant Chandan, you were shaking your head there. Jim was essentially saying that it was Gaddafi's fault for leaving this vacuum that was filled by chaos. Your view is actually the opposite, that he was stability, and without him, Libya has descended into chaos. Is that your view?
The world-class arsonists were at work from the inception of the NATO no-fly zone, which was just a cover for a war of destruction and ruin against Libya. These are the arsonists. And it's good to be on a show again 6 years later with Mr. Gamaty, because 6 years ago we were on a show together in which Mr. Gamaty made certain allegations and claims which have proven to be absolutely false. And at the time, you can see on YouTube the clip, he got very upset and flustered and shouted down the studio and ran out of the studio. But Mr. Gamaty was one exactly of the people who facilitated, who was a lead personality in the media that facilitated the arsonists to in the destruction of Libya.
What do you mean by arsonists? Sorry, can you just explain? Can you just explain the arsonists?
You know, Mr. Gamaty said there's regional interference, that pouring oil onto the fire in Libya. But who started the fire in the first place? It was none other than NATO and its proxies, including Mr. Gamaty. And 6 years on, everything in Libya, if you compare it to before the collapse of the former government of the Libyan Jamahiriya, on every single level that you can see it, it's a total collapse and destruction, be it in terms of state institutions, security, education, health, oil production, economy. Now you have slavery, you have actual slavery on the edge of Europe in the 21st century, and that's not surprising because the first acts of Mr. Gamaty's allies in Libya, which were the proxies of NATO on the ground, lynched en masse darker skinned and black people. And Mr. Gamaty himself, like many others like him, are unable to return back to their country. And when Mr. Gamaty tried that in 2014, I was very sad to hear that he himself was kidnapped and abducted and tortured for 2 days by the very militias that he was supporting in 2011. And he was dumped in a field without his clothes.
John Louis, okay, that's the background, and it's very divisive still. The debate about the NATO intervention and what went happen continues to this day. But on the ground, what's the reality that we're dealing with here? Because essentially, we see Libya split into two, but it's more than that too, correct, John?
Yes, it's a misunderstanding that Libya is divided in two camps. In reality, there are two broad coalitions that are quite fluid, confronting each other. And it's true that there is also a geopolitical component playing out in Libya between those who support political Islam and those who do not. Again, these are kind of summary descriptions. I would like also to comment on what my two predecessors have said, and I tend to agree with portions of their arguments. They're not wrong, they're complementing each other. It's not because the intervention had many wrongs that there are no structural reasons for Libyan instability and struggles to achieve a democratic transition. All that Mr. Guma El-Gamaty said is correct. Libya did have structural challenges that it would have had to face, whichever way it had transitioned to another regime after Gaddafi. And in terms of transitioning, I think that it was a transition bound to happen. If the NATO intervention hadn't happened, still Libyans would have reason against Gaddafi. This is my personal conviction. And in the merit of the intervention, I think the discussion there is fruitless. The intervention happened. I think it's more fruitful to talk about what kind of intervention and the mistakes that were done during the intervention. And there is plenty of blame to be apportioned to the European countries, notably France, UK, and the United States. But there is also plenty of blame to be apportioned to Qatar, the UAE, and many other countries.
Good point. Elissa, I want to bring you in here. So where are we? Lots of sort of acronyms thrown around. We have a government of national accord, the GNA, but that's sort of weak and has sort of been having to move itself around and face Islamic threats. We have the Libyan National Army as well, which has a different head that is also battling for control, and then all these other groups. What is the situation on the ground, and why haven't we been able to see progress with this UN-backed process?
So as Jean-Louis said, it is correct that there are sort of these broad two camps between those supporting the UN-backed government, the GNA, the Government of National Accord, and on the other side, those backing the Eastern government and Khalifa Haftar, who leads the Libyan National Army, the LNA. But I would agree with the other individuals who highlighted the fact that the lack of progress started before this conflict worsened in 2014 with the divide between these two camps. And so now you're seeing the impact of the internal divides and the lack of consensus that exists among these camps. So while the UN has tried to insert more life into a political process and into a peace deal. There's mistrust on both sides. There are exclamations of rhetorical support, both from the actors in Libya and also from their external international supporters. But what you see on the ground is that support or actual in practice, in terms of comparing that to rhetorical exclamations, they generally don't line up. And I think that has been the problem, is that those actors on the ground are not willing to make in many cases, take the steps that are needed to actually start a peace process in good faith, and that is complicated by the international arena.
Sukant Chandan, who are the foreign backers of which groups here? Because obviously we have European powers like France and Italy with interests, but also Middle Eastern powers as well, correct?
Fundamentally, Libya has been destroyed. It had 41 years of progress on education, health, economy, etc., at the highest HDI indexes in all of Africa. So fundamentally, it was a war, which I said early in 2011, and I still say it today, and I think facts have been proven correctly. It was a war led by Paris and London, in which the United States did most of the military work. And yes, the other junior partners to that were countries in the Gulf, particularly the Qataris, who committed many special forces, especially in the final NATO push against the Jamahiriya in Tripoli. So there are all of these foreign players at work, but there's also some development. Mr. Salama, who's a diplomat from Lebanon, has been sent by the United Nations to actually develop a reconciliation program, which includes the most politically supported factions of all the Libyans, which actually are the factions in supportive of the former government of the Jamahiriya. Generally, it's called the Green Resistance, has 4 or 5 different trends in it. They are invited into that because they are a legitimate political force, and they are the only political community that can return Libya as it once was for 41 years on peace and unity, and using its God-given national wealth for the upliftment of all the Libyan people, especially the poorest. So Saif al-Islam Gaddafi as well, the most senior member of this political forces, is also invited into that process, and that is the kind of process we need to push forward if Libya is to see any semblance of stability again.
Okay, well, the Jamahiriya and the White Book and the Green Book were not without its controversy, to say the least. But in this vacuum, Guma, we have seen a lot of problems. Mass migration has increased through Libya into Europe. We've seen terrorist groups such as ISIS take control of Muammar Gaddafi's former town of Sirte, and more threats of terrorism. Is this what is actually holding back a peace process? Is this splitting Libya apart, these two other problems that they're having?
There are multiple factors of why we have the situation we have today, and we cannot just brush them away and say no, it's all a big conspiracy from NATO and the West. This leftist conspiracy theory, I don't buy it anymore, and I don't even bother waste my time to engage with it. What's happening now, because of the lack of state building, lack of institutions, lack of security, we have the problem of, by the way, migration problem was there since 2000, the year 2000. Gaddafi manipulated the migration from Africa through to Europe very well. It was there for a long time. The ISIS is a new phenomena. It came into Libya as well, but then the biggest presence of ISIS outside Iraq and Syria, which was in Sirte, was dealt with very effectively last year, and that was eradicated. So the presence of ISIS in Libya is now probably reduced by over 90%. What we have is a state of conflict between people who cannot agree to share power and wealth fairly, and this conflict is fueled by other countries, especially Arab countries on one side or the other, who want to have their own interests guaranteed in the new Libya. All this is not helping. The UN is trying hard, but what we need is a determined international. We need a strong international will to really ask the regional countries to refrain from detrimental interference, and we need pressure on the conflicting parties in Libya to come together and agree a compromise. We need a new constitution, which we have a draft already, and we need new elections, and we need to start in earnest the state and institution building in Libya, which is 48 years late.
Okay, thank you. John Louis, I want to just play you this clip from Jeremy Lawrence, the spokesperson on the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, about the migration problem and the fact that the Europeans may be creating a problem in terms of their interventions. Let's have a listen.
The increasing interventions of the EU and its member states have done nothing so far to reduce the levels of abuses suffered by migrants. Our monitoring, in fact, shows a fast deterioration in their situation in Libya. The international community cannot continue to turn a blind eye to the unimaginable horrors endured by migrants in Libya and pretend that the situation can be remedied by improving conditions in detention.
You know, we've all seen the pictures of people fleeing, you know, across the Mediterranean, but obviously Europe has wanted to keep these people out. This is one of the really dark sides of what's been happening in Libya, hasn't it? Because the conditions of people who cannot cross is sometimes even worse.
Absolutely. I had already warned for years now, and definitely most recently with the measures that were taken to contain the flow of migrants coming from the continent in Africa and elsewhere through Libya, coming to Europe. This policy is not going to bear fruits. As a matter of fact, it will transform in a political and humanitarian disaster. It's going to be a boomerang. I've been warning that for a while. I said it publicly a month ago during a conference in Washington. The situation needs to be addressed differently. Libya lacks the institutions for itself. It lacks the institutions to handle the flow of migrants and to host migrants in Libya in humane conditions. Containing the flow is not going to stop the influx of migrants from the south. It's increasing actually the cost that migrants are paying to transit from the south to the shores. The detention centers are not under the control of the authorities, and the authorities do not have the capacity to ensure proper conditions of detention. Now, mind yourself though, this condition here is not new, it's worsening, but the situation was bad already under Gaddafi. Slavery is something that existed in Libya and elsewhere already before the intervention. So victimizing Libya, we need to again look at the details and understand what's going on. We should not help authorities contain the flow of migrants. We should not think that our authorities are in control of detention centers when they control maybe 10% of them. And we should not think that by stopping boats from the shores of Libya, we will stop the flow of migrants coming to Libya.
Well,